Hello there, Flip here, and today, you know what? I haven't given any hot takes in a while. Let's piss people off by giving my opinions on who I think are the most underrated and overrated units in each element. And I'm going to be going by infusion priority, so Pyro, Hydro, Electro, Cryo, and then just Onimo, Geo, and Dendro. And also, England lost to France at the World Cup, so as promised, I'll be doing my very best to daily upload all throughout this week. And after 2 all-nighters on both Saturday and Sunday, I have planned out my week meticulously and thoroughly to have 7 videos ready, but we'll see how it goes. Anyways, the way I'm going to be doing this is by, well, yes, I'll go over each element and talk about a character or characters I think are overrated or underrated by the general community. And no, this does not mean the characters I call overrated are bad, it's just that their perception in the community from what I've seen is higher than I think it needs to be. And for underrated characters, I'm not saying they're extremely strong units, it's just that I think their perception in the community is lower than it actually is. And just keep in mind, this is going to be from my perspective and what I've seen in Twitter threads, Reddit, Discord, etc. If you have differing opinions, feel free to comment and discuss them, but try to keep it civil, or don't. I'll be able to get a laugh out of it. And lastly, before we get into the video, as always, if at any point during the video you're entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing, as I talk on varying topics regarding Genshin's meta, and I'll try to keep you updated. And now, without further ado, let's talk about who I think are the most overrated and underrated characters in each element. Not gonna lie, I actually drew a blank at the first element, because if you look at the Pyro roster and try to count the strong units in Pyro, it's just Hu Tao, Bennett, Xiangling, and that's kind of about it. Pyro has the most damage dealers out of any element, so when most of them are just basically competing against the already established Hu Tao and Xiangling, the community from what I've seen just pushes aside and really talks about most of the other Pyro characters, except for one who recently got quite strong that I'll talk about when covering who's underrated. So yeah, unless you want to make the argument for Xiangling, Hu Tao, or Bennett, I really don't think any of the Pyro characters currently are overrated. Again, maybe you can say Bennett because people seem to think he goes into every fucking team possible. Whenever I say that C6 Bennett is good and then I hear people say that he ruins Ike or Eula, it just reminds me of that. But Bennett is really just that strong, so I don't think it's too much of a detriment that his general perception is really high. Anyways, moving on to underrated Pyro units, I actually had a lot I wanted to cover. At first, my mind went to Klee, because Klee's biggest flaw is kind of just that she feels shit to play, and also on her staple team you can kind of just... and yeah, you get a way better team. But for what it is, Mono Pyro Klee does do a lot of damage and is in line with a lot of the other AoE teams like Mono Geo. And Klee does help with juggling some of the more annoying enemies like Rift Hounds and Lore Trolls. But after a lot more thinking, there is one character that not only the entire community shat on, I did too, Thoma. Before Dendro, Thoma was just not that great. His shielding is amazing, but that was about it. He was competing with Bennett for the Pyro support slot and he just lost almost every single time. But now with Dendro we have Burgeon, and because of Thoma's slow Pyro application, he allows you to trigger Burgeon on Dendro seeds quite frequently, while also not applying enough Pyro that you end up burning your enemy and fucking up reactions. And even though you'll be running him on a full Elemental Mastery build, his Pyro shield still offers some sort of mitigation from the Burgeon cores. The weird thing about Thoma though is that after like the first 2 weeks of Dendro, I just for some reason have not heard anything about the team. Maybe due to the fact that it's somewhat expensive or people are more interested in Hyperbloom. But regardless, Thoma's Burgeon team, which will usually consist of Nahida, a Hydra unit, and either another Hydra unit or a non-trigger like Fischl, is actually really good and a Thoma team I can actually recommend without it being a meme. The only real thing is energy requirements, and I might be worth crafting an R5 Ketane if you want to main this team frequently. Now moving on to Hydro, this was also kind of hard. To be a good Hydro character in Genshin, you literally just need to apply Hydro. You can either A, apply a lot of Hydro very quickly, or B, apply Hydro slowly in a wide enough area. Both Freeze and Bloom teams can appreciate somewhat slow Hydro application as not an excessive amount is required. The only reason Barbara is less talked about is due to uptime issues and her range is quite small. So the only Hydro characters I think you can even call overrated is either like Mona or Yelan. But even then, I've seen so much more hate for Yelan than actual praise. So I think it's unfair to call her overrated. And I have seen like 2 people talk about Mona in the past month. So I think it's unfair to call her overrated too. So I don't really have an answer, I'll leave it to you guys. As for underrated, again, I think most of the Hydra units now are held in a good regard. We have Xingqiu, everyone loves him. I talked about Mona and Yelan. Barbara is a character. Candace sucks. Nilo? Ayato, no one cares about him. Oh, it's Child, isn't it? So with Ajax, Tartaglia, Child, Ed Sheeran, whatever the fuck you want to call him, it's not important. I do admit I was a part of the problem, but people do seem to underestimate how well Child measures up. I see people all the time compare Child to Ayato and say Child isn't great because he only really has one team. But at the same time, if that team is what many consider the best team in the game for almost all content types, it really isn't that big of an issue. And you guys should all know I'm talking about the international team: Child, Bennett, Xiangling, and Asuka Sarkazaha. Child contributes a lot to this team in many ways. Not only is Child able to frontload a lot of damage with his burst even with lower investment, he also applies a fuckton of hydro in a massive area for Xiangling, allowing her to vaporize her entire Pyronator for consistent damage. Tartaglia's main role on this team is to enable AoE vapes from Xiangling, but his damage still really cannot be slapped on either. Child does really want a 5-star bow though, as his 4-star options aren't really anything special, and good mechanics are also going to be required to pull off the infamous international second rotation. But yeah, besides that, if you don't decide to stay on Child for 20 seconds, there are little things stopping him from being great. Just don't put rust on him, please. Also, speaking of 5-star weapons, thank god that isn't even that big of an issue, because Hoyo decides to release a new broken one every 2 fucking patches. Holy shit, do we need another bow? Claymore characters have been eating shit for years now. Now with my personal favorite element, Electro. With Electro, there are a few standout characters people like to overhype, and again I am no better. I sell Fischl at every possible moment because she's literally her. But for overrated Electro characters, I was holding back everything possible from saying Sarah. Sarah is one of the worst feeling characters to me, and in her niche of buffing Electro characters, she isn't really great at doing that, and only really allows for extremely front-loaded damage on Raiden. Or, if your Keqing is at quite high investment in both artifacts and weapons, it's not that bad of an idea to pair her with Sarah either. The only thing is I really can't say Sarah is overrated because who is overrating her? This character just isn't talked about enough for me to call her that anymore. But fuck it, there's literally no one else I can really put here, so it just has to be her. As for who I think is the most underrated Electro character, this might come off as a surprise, but I'm going to go with Yae. I don't know if I've been gaslighted by all the Yae simps around me, but very little people I've seen actually know. That's a lie. Everyone besides fucking Yae simps don't talk enough about how strong her aggravate teams are. With the biggest drawback the team has is the fact that it has no healer. Yae still is one of the most horrendous characters I've played. It is not an enjoyable experience whatsoever, but at least the trade-off this time isn't an average team, but one of the best teams within the archetype. Also, I think Yae would be a lot more appreciated if people stopped looking at her as a Fischl replacement, and instead as sort of a carry. Even on aggravate, because you want to drive Fischl's A4, you want to stay on Yae and auto attack to trigger more aggravates on Fischl. And on Yae's Taser team, even though she isn't on field much here, besides her obligatory EEEQ EEE, you still want to use her and Fischl to complement each other instead of trying to replace them with each other. The last thing I want to talk about with Yae is the Raikou team, because it's the only Yae team that doesn't suck to play for me. On this team with Raiden, Bennett, and Kazuha, the fun thing about it is that it's basically just cycling back and forth between Raiden and Yae's fucking nuclear bombs, and allows you to just blow away enemies with a lot of front-loaded damage. The gameplay loop is literally just group enemies with Kazuha, stand in Bennett's circle for a nuke and let it rip, and it's just extremely fun to me. Moving on to the element with the hottest characters, Cryo. For Cryo characters, it's extremely easy to narrow it down this time, and no, I'm not going to be an NPC and go with Ganyu. My choice is actually going to be Diona for a few reasons. Since we are at the midway point in the video, I just want to again say, for any character I call overrated, I am not saying they are bad, just that their perception is higher than what people expect. For Diona, the first thing I need to point out is her C6, because there's actually very little use for it, despite how good it sounds on paper. Besides using it for a showcase, what team would you use this on? Most vaporized teams have Yolana or another Anemo character locked in as the last slot, and for Hutawa it isn't even an option as it just doesn't work with her. And you don't want to use Diona on reverse melt either, as she does no damage, so it's just a net loss for most teams. The only real case I can see for it is Melt Ganyu, but like, Her Constellation 6 just doesn't really have a good use now, but even then, outside of her constellations, a lot of people seem to think Diona is the best option on a team like Morgana or Ayaka Freeze, when that again isn't really the case. Diona is a good option there, yes, no denying that, but for Ayaka, if you were to pull a Kokomi, Diona loses a ton of value there as she's purely for mitigation, and Kokomi herself can cover that. And for Morgana, unless you are taking a lot of damage on really annoying enemies like the Abyss Heralds, or enemies you can't keep grouped like Rift Hounds, Venti and Freeze should be enough crowd control to where you don't really need that heavy of mitigation. But again, if you just want to have the comfort, then sure. Diona was really helpful to my Freeze teams before I got Kokomi, but after that I just didn't look back once. Oh yeah, there are also Eula teams where I think Diona is really good as she compresses a lot of roles that Eula wants. And my pick for underrated cryo characters is going to be Shenhe. It's not that anyone in the community really views her negatively, it's just that I think a lot of people see her in the wrong way. People basically just summarize her as being a premium cryo unit like Ayaka or Ganyu, and while that is true, I think that discredits the fact that she is used well as a secondary cryo for any team that wants it. The Shenhe team I like the most is actually a reverse melt team with Rosaria, as it does have a cheap core but gets giga boosted with Shenhe there, and it's not something I see many people talk about. So now Anemo, I was really just debating saying Kazuha, and everyone would probably just accept that, but no, I'll shoot out an actual hot take. I know I said overrated doesn't mean a character is bad, but Jean is kind of... Yes, my pick is Jean for the most overrated Anemo unit, because the more I thought about it, the more I was just like, why is this character so praised? I think it's due in part to the fact that there isn't that much bad to say about Jean, and because at the beginning of the game when we had quite the small Anemo selection, Jean was quite valued then, but as we've just had more and more Anemo units, Jean's relevance hasn't really changed much, if at all. A lot of people, including me, held Jean high because of Sunfire, which is the combination of Jean and Bennett to apply constant pyro to the enemy. But almost all Sunfire teams get bottlenecked by energy, and even for Raiden Sunfire, it's just not amazing, and requires you to play Circle Impact for very mediocre damage. There isn't anything bad to say about Jean really, but she barely has any redeeming traits. She's an Anemo character with negative grouping, her crit build doesn't do a lot of damage, as her stats mostly focus towards energy. She doesn't swirl a lot unless she's on a Sunfire team, which isn't that great, and doesn't offer much besides Viridescent and healing, which is something even Sayu can do. You know what, at this point in the game I would argue Sayu is better, which actually leads me to who I think is the most underrated Anemo character, which in my opinion is Sayu. Her reputation in the meta community has kind of just been Jean downgrade, but let's talk about it. They take around the same amount of field time, generate about the same amount of particles, Sayu has off-field swirls regardless, unlike Jean swirls which are very conditional, and at C6 you can get both bursts of damage and healing. Also about the way Sayu swirls, the thing is that this allows Sayu to build a decent amount of EM for a hybrid build, where Jean you either have to go with full EM or go for a crit build. And no, I'm not done there. Sayu also doesn't have to take one of the most valued Favonius weapons unlike Jean, because there is literally no one in competition for the Favonius Greatsword. And Sayu also has a much bigger radius than Jean, making her a lot more comfortable to play. If you can get her to C6, I really think she's quite a solid Anemo option, and with her spin mechanic can create some really fun teams that I can't try out on my account because I don't have Sayu. Fuck this game. You guys don't understand the temptation I had, but I have talked about Zhongli enough. This is basically beating a dead horse. Instead of going with the Geo Archon, I'm going to go with Yunjin as my most overrated Geo character. Yunjin is kind of only really good for Yoimiya, and don't get me wrong, she is really good for Yoimiya, so much so that you can ditch Bennett on her. But besides that, I can't really think of a character that she just doesn't directly hinder instead of help. I guess she can be really good for Aito if you've pumped some investment into his damage, but I don't know if it's really worth running that over Aito's other teams, especially now with the addition of Dendro. And in general, not many characters have a majority of their damage loaded into normal attacks, and even with some of the few that do, it is usually less valuable than having other supports, or off-field damage dealers there. For Noelle, you can get away with using Yunjin, but once you get a better Geo replacement like Albedo or Zhongli, she's one of the first ones you opt to replace. For Eula, one of her team slots is already taken by an Electro for Superconduct, another is taken for a cryo battery, and it's just more preferred to have some sort of mitigation or another cryo battery there, as that tends to outweigh Yunjin's benefit. For Razor, anyways, those were basically the only notable options to mention. And now for an underrated Geo unit, I'm actually going to be going with the Geo main character, just because of this one thing he can do that no other Geo character can. If you go to a statue of the 7 outside of Leeway, you can automatically just switch him to a good element. And finally, we can move on to Dendro. There are 4 Dendro characters. What do I even say here? Of course, a lot of people are hyping up Nahida. She's great in the meta, no denying that, so I feel it would be dumb to call her overrated. Cole is the cutest character in the game, but nothing much to say. Dendro MC is solid. Tighnari, the best looking male character in the game, and again, he's just pretty solid. He's great with quick and quick swap teams with characters like Keqing, Yae, and Lisa. Again, nothing much to really say. The Dendro roster currently is just way too small to call anyone overrated or underrated, so we can just leave it at that for now. And on that note, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment what you think about my choices, as I'd love to hear your thoughts and I respond to almost every single comment. Once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys... Oh wait, I'll see you guys tomorrow, because